Fulgrim smiled as Pharasmanis renewed his attack into the heart of the defensive lines atop the Urgal Depression. Backlit by the flaring strobe of battle, his brother was a magnificent figure of vengeance, his silver hands and eyes reflecting the fires of slaughter with a brilliant gleam. For the briefest second, Fulgrim had been sure that Ferris would pause to muster with the Raven Guard and Salamanders. But after his daring challenge atop the rock, there would be no restraining his brother. Around him, the last of the Phoenix Guard awaited the blunt wedge of the Iron Hands, their golden halberds held low and aimed towards their foes. Marius and his willing sonic weapon howled in anticipation of the combat, and Julius, almost unrecognizable, with his skin burnt from his bones, ran a blistered tongue along the lipless ruin of his mouth. Pharasmanis and his Morlocks charged through the shattered ruin of the defenses, his black armor and their burnished plates scarred and stained with the blood of enemies. Fulgrim's fixed smile faltered as he truly appreciated the depths of hatred his brother held for him, and wondered again how they had come to this point, knowing that any chance for brotherhood was lost. Only in death could this end. The retreat of the War Master's forces appeared ragged and faltering, exactly as Horus had planned it. Warriors streamed back from the front lines of battle in determined groups, their spirits apparently broken, but gathering in knots of resistance behind shelled ruins and fire-blackened craters. The Iron Hands pushed through the defenses, the bulky Terminators unstoppable in their relentless advance. Lightning crackled from the claws of their gauntlets, and their red eyes shone with anger. The Phoenix Guard braced themselves to meet the charge, fully aware of the power of such mighty suits of armor. Marius released a howl of ecstatic joy, and his bizarre weapon amplified it into screeching wails of deadly harmonics that ripped through the ground in whirring sonic waves to explode amongst the front ranks of the Morlocks. The giant warriors were torn apart in clashing shrieks of oral power as the apocalyptic noise made play of their armor and butter of their flesh. The Emperor's children screamed in pleasure at the sound when their enhanced senses and augmented brain paths rendering the discordant sounds into the most vivid sensations imaginable. "When they come," shouted Fulgrim, "leave Pharasmanis to me." The Phoenix Guard answered with a terrible war cry and leapt to meet the Morlocks in a searing clash of blades. Electric fire leapt from the golden edges of the halberds and claws of the warriors, and a storm of light and sound flared from each life and death struggle. The battle engulfed the Primarch of the Emperor's children, but he stood above it, awaiting the dark-armored giant who strode inviolate through the lightning, shock carnage as brothers hacked at one another in hatred. Fulgrim nodded in greeting as Ferris reached towards a sword belted at his waist. He smiled as he recognized Fireblade's hilt. "You remade my sword," said Fulgrim, his voice cutting through the atrocious din of fighting. Though the ferocious battle between the Morlocks and the Phoenix Guard surrounded them, neither Primarch's Praetorians dared approach them, as though aware that to transgress this fateful confrontation would be a heinous crime. Only to see you dead by a weapon forged by my own hand, spat Ferris. In response, Fulgrim sheathed his silver sword and reached behind him to unlimber the great warhammer held at his back. Then I shall do likewise. The great weight of Forgebreaker, the weapon his own skill and engineers had crafted beneath the peaks of Mount Nerodina, felt good in his hands as he descended the rock to face his erstwhile brother. It is fitting that we face one another with the weapons we forged long ago, said Fulgrim. I have long waited for this moment, Fulgrim, replied Ferris. Ever since you came to me with betrayal in your heart. For months, I have dreamt of this reckoning. Only one of us will walk away from this. You know that. I know that, agreed Fulgrim. You betrayed the Emperor, and you betrayed me, said Ferris. And Fulgrim was surprised to hear genuine emotion in his brother's voice. I came to you because of our friendship, not despite it, answered Fulgrim. The universe is changing. The old order upset, and a new dawn approaching. I offered you the chance to be a part of the new order, but you threw it back at me. You sought to make me a traitor, snarled Ferris. Horus is mad. Look at all this death. How can this be right? You will hang from Traitor's Gibbet for this sedition. For I am the Emperor's loyal servant, and through me his will and vengeance will be done. The Emperor is a spent force, snapped Fulgrim. Even now, he whittles away on some trivia in the dungeons of Terra, while his realm is in flames. Are those the actions of a being fit to rule the galaxy? Do not think you can win me to your cause, Fulgrim. You failed once. You will not get a second chance. Fulgrim shook his head. I am not offering you a second chance, Ferris. It is already too late for you and your warriors. Ferris laughed at him, but he could sense the despair in it. Are you mad, Fulgrim? It's over. You and the War Master are defeated. Your forces are rooted, and the power of another 4 legions will soon crush your attempt at rebellion utterly. Fulgrim was unable to keep the sensations seething in his head contained any longer, and he shook his head as he savored his next words. My brother, how naive you are. Do you really think Horus would be foolish enough to trap himself like this? Look to the north, and you will see it is you who are undone. Hey friend, it's me, the Ebony Otaku, the well-rounded nerd. Still having some Halloween fun with the Warhammer. There's just so much. The amount of books I have, oh my god, the lore, there's so much lore. I can never get to it all. We are going to come back to Eisenhorn and Fabius Bile. But I honestly have not finished reading Fabius Bile. So as I read, I mark those passages that I might want to revisit. In Eisenhorn, I'm still doing a little bit more study to refresh myself on how certain sequences of events happened. But I do know the passages that I will be reading out of Eisenhorn. That was the very first Warhammer book I ever read, and it's what got me hooked. How old was I? I think I was 17 when I got that book, and that was years ago. So been all in ever since. So we're gonna come back to those, but it's Halloween, and what better set of Space Marine stories to read than those of treachery and betrayal? So we talked a little bit about Fulgrim's motivations in the last one, and I rambled a little bit, but I think I can make better sense of it now. Fulgrim is the jilted child. He is the one who was forgotten, who did his best to prove to the Emperor that he was just as worthy as his other brothers, but his other brothers still stood out higher and further ahead of him. And because of the blight, the genetic blight that the Emperor's children had, that kept them out of the battlefield longer than the other legions. So, I mean, Fulgrim was just full of spite. He didn't know he was full of spite, and that's where chaos is dangerous. And I think that's so important to examine in this modern age that we're in. Good fiction always has an element of realistic truth in it. That's why we love these stories. We're not just delving into fantasy, but it's fantasy that connects to the world that we're in. What has happened to half of the legions, because that's how it went. Half the legions went pro-Emperor, half went pro-Chaos, or Horus, or pro-Self. Pro not the Imperium of Man, but what you see happening is what happens in great kingdoms and countries and parliaments and congresses that's been happening through history. It's happening all around us right now. The person who is supposed to be the most in touch with his sons has left the battling and the ruling of his empire to his sons. And without him being physically present with them, latent thoughts that may have just crossed their mind at one point have now taken root. They're no longer passing thoughts. They've had an opportunity to become germinated seeds that are growing into resentment in some of them. Chaos does not create the evil. Chaos merely exists in the world of Warhammer. You know, what's the phrase? I tell you what, the light in my office, like, sun is just not being my friend today, so apologies for the lighting. But anywho, the Emperor of Mankind, when he began his great crusade, was out with his sons battling. He was seeing their achievements. He was celebrating with them. He was mourning with them. There was a time where even legionaries could interact with the Emperor of Mankind because he was out there doing battle. And even in human history, there was a time when heads of state did not stay home when wars were happening. Heads of state were part of it. Even if they weren't on the front line, they were there. I'll give you a real good example that's historical and biblical. So King David. Yeah, y'all know who King David is. Probably one of, if the not greatest, king of the Israelites, historically. Real person, not made up. FYI. But King David was blessed by God. He was honored by the heavens. And King David was a king in a time where kings did go out to war. There came a point in King David's rule where he was like, the battlers can go battle. And he hung out at home in his palace. Now, a little historical context, things were done a little bit differently back then than they are now. And all of this is going to make sense in just a second. So a lot of people who have grown up churched know the story of David and Bathsheba. And there are many interpretations of what that story means. I'm going to give you the real deal. So at that point in the Middle Eastern culture, and I learned this studying to teach the story myself at one point. But at that point in Middle Eastern culture, when it was time for women to bathe themselves, they waited to a certain part of the day where baths and water that was outside for them was heated up by the sun. And everyone knew, all the men knew to be inside because the women were going to be doing their thing. And then they go, do their thing, get dressed, go back inside. Like there's nothing untoward about it. It's just cultural. All the men knew to be inside. Well, King David is out, should be in battle, has left his people, his army to fight for him, has left the battlefield, and he's at home chilling where he should not be. He should be out on the battlefield. And at the time of day that everybody knows the women are going to be out doing woman stuff, he's hanging out on the roof of his palace and catches Bathsheba and says, "Ooh, her." That's what happened. Now, what David did was a sin against heaven and his people. He took that woman. He said, "I like her. She's fine. I see everything about her." But he wouldn't have seen her had he not been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Had he been out on the battlefield with his armies like the kings and rulers of old were supposed to, that story never would have happened. If you don't know how it ends, David, word I can't say, Bathsheba, and then on top of it, she gets pregnant. He gets her pregnant. And how are you going to be pregnant when your husband's not home? He recalls her husband from the front line, a loyal soldier, to come home and have a weekend with his wife. But this man is so loyal. He said, "I cannot enjoy a night with my wife while my men are out getting slaughtered." What an honorable human being. Has no idea what his wife has been through. Has no idea what David's done. And David's like, crap. He didn't sleep with her. Now what am I going to do? Goes back to the battlefield. And David arranges for him to be murdered on the battlefield. So battle took him. Well, eventually, Bathsheba does give birth to their child. And child is afflicted. And child dies. And eventually, David has a mental break, a break of his spirit when he realizes what he's done. It is because of him that a husband and wife are eternally separated now. He produced a child that could not live, and he is verklempt because he has sinned against God and he has violated his people at the same time. He has done the worst. And he repents for it. And he goes back to being what he should. And he actually gives Bathsheba rank in his imperial harem. And they have another child who ends up growing up. And there's other history that goes with that. But it was because David wasn't where he was supposed to be that situation happened. And that's exactly what's happening with the Emperor on Terra. The Emperor of Mankind has left the battling to his sons. And he's on Terra doing whatever it is he's doing in the Himalayan mountains. No one knows. He's just in there. Malcador the Sigillite knows. Nobody but Malcador knows what the Emperor is doing. And because he's not there, there's stuff happening that just simply should not be happening if the Emperor was where he was supposed to be. Now, granted, because of age and whatnot, there comes a point where people can't do all the things they did when they were 35. But that's not the case. We're talking about an immortal being with godlike powers. He could have been out there. And what he thought was, I'm placing trust in my sons to get the job done. What it really did, after several hundred years passed, what it really did was put seeds of resentment in them. Why is he over there and we're out here dying in his name? They didn't know they had those feelings until chaos exploited it. David was a king who was called a man after God's own heart, who did not know that level of evil was in him until he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. The emperor assumed all his sons to be loyal, because why would they not be loyal? They're the sons of the emperor. But when we neglect our relationships, when we neglect conversations, when we neglect quality time, that's where seeds of resentment and eventually betrayal can grow. When relationships fail, they fail gradually and then suddenly. Can you tell I'm a trainer for a living? There's a really good book called Fierce Conversations by Susan Scott, which is actually something that, a course that I teach in my regular job, but it's a publicly available book and I highly recommend it. It is a nonfiction, it is a business book, it is a how to have conversations and relationships book. But in that book, she references Ernest Hemingway's, one of Ernest Hemingway's novels. And there is a character in there that goes through a bankruptcy. And he's asked, how did this happen? Because this was somebody who was very prominent, and then they lost everything. And they're asked, well, how did this happen to you? And his response is, it happened first gradually, and then suddenly. There are moments along timelines that if we're not staying awake during those gradual moments, they can add up to a suddenly that we did not expect. That the betrayal of his sons is a suddenly that the emperor was not expecting. But he was not awake in those gradual moments because he assumed loyalty. You know why marriages fail? Because people are not awake in the gradual moments of their relationships, of that conversation that wasn't had, of not being open and receptive to hearing and feeling what another person is going through, of not being able to have consistent conversation about finances, managing a household, division of duties, and all of those other things. Those are all gradual moments that seem insignificant, but eventually each of those moments adds up to a suddenly. But the opposite is also true. If we stay awake during our gradual moments, we can produce a suddenly that we desire. If we stay awake in our relationships, we can produce a beautiful marriage. If we stay awake in raising our children, we can produce amazing citizens. If we stay awake in our finances, we can have more control over what happens to us versus all that stuff out there ruining our lives. We can control what we can control. But the vast majority of humans sleep through the graduals. We coast through life. The Space Marines are asleep in the graduals. They are blind followers of their Primarchs. They are implanted literally with their genetic makeup. If you are a child of the Emperor, one of the Emperor's children, you have Fulgrim's gene seed in you. If you are a Blood Angel, you've got Sanguinius's genetic material in you. If you are a Primarch, you are a part of the Emperor. Much like parents and children, you've got their genetics in you. That's just how it works. So having that genetics in you means there is still a predisposition for those graduals to catch up. Even though the Emperor is the godlike representation of the Warhammer universe, whether he wanted to be worshipped or not, that's a whole other thing for another day. The Emperor was asleep in his graduals. He made assumptions about who his people were, who his sons were, and what they were capable of doing, and how loyal they would be when it came down to it. He was asleep in those moments. The Space Marines were asleep. The Primarchs themselves were asleep to their own feelings. Rather than going to the Emperor and having the conversation, rather than the Emperor going to his sons and having the conversation, everyone avoids it. And then gradually adds up to a suddenly. And then there's chaos. Chaos, honestly, I would call it a neutral evil, even though it's got chaos in the name, because chaos doesn't see themselves as chaos. Chaos has existed long before the Imperium of Man. Chaos was there before the Eldar. It is as old as time. If you're an Adventure Time fan, before there was, the Earth, there was time, and before there was time, there were monsters. That's chaos. They were always there. So they look at the humans as the intruders, and they're only in anything for themselves. So when they see a feature to exploit, they exploit it greatly. That's how cheaterations happen in relationships. There is something there that can be exploited. And if those graduals aren't paid attention to, exploitation can happen in the worst way. So now we've got Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus, two of the Emperor's sons, who were closer to one another than they were to any of the other brothers. They were so close that actually when they met and had a meeting of the minds, because you got to remember, the Emperor's children are all about the flash and pizzazz. And Ferrus Manus and his Iron Warriors, they're all about the utilitarian and the strength. They got that whole Wolves of Fenris thing going on. They're all about the and Fulgrim's all about the They're very different. But they found commonality in their pursuit of perfection, but they pursue their perfection in different ways. When they meet, they have a great contest with one another. And Fulgrim forges a hammer in their competition. And Ferrus Manus forges a sword. And each weapon is exquisite and represents perfection. And they exchanged weapons as a show of their brotherhood. But when Fulgrim brought the idea of betraying the Emperor to Ferrus, they found out how different they were. Because at some point, they were asleep in the graduals of their own relationship. And one of them was a loyalist, and one of them was a traitor. And they took back their weapons, which is a symbolic severing of their bond. And now they're on Istvan 5. And we know what happens on Istvan V. It ain't good. The loyalists have been pulled into a trap. Ferrus believes he is facing his brother to bring him to justice. And it's about to be bad. Shall we pick it up? I think now's a good point. The forces of the Raven Guard and Salamanders fell back in good order to the drop zone, where their reinforcements were deploying to join the fight. The drop ships of the Iron Warriors, armored bastions connected by high walls of spiked barricades, formed an unbroken line of grim fortifications on the north slopes of the Urgal Depression. A force larger than that which had first begun the assault on Istvan mustered in the landing zone, armed and ready for battle, unbloodied and fresh. Corax and Vulcan led their forces back to regroup and to allow the warriors of their brother Primarchs to measure the glory in defeating Horus, dragging their wounded and dead with them. The victory had been won, but the cost had been steep indeed, with thousands of all three legions lost to the betrayal of the War Master. Horus's forces were in retreat, but there would be no celebration of the slaughter, no joyous victory feast or glorious days of remembrance. Only another sad scroll added to a banner that would never again see the light of day. Scorched tanks rumbled alongside the Astartes, their ammunition expended and their hulls battered by the impact of shot and shell. Unanswered voxhails requested medical aid and supply, but the line of Astartes at the top of the North Ridge was grimly silent as the exhausted warriors of the Raven Guard and Salamanders came within 100 meters of their allies. A lone flare shot skyward from inside the black fortress Horus had made his lair, exploding in hellish red glow that lit the battlefield below like a madman's vision at the end of the world. And the fire of betrayal roared from the barrels of 1,000 guns. Fulgrim laughed at the stunned look on Ferrus's face as the forces of his allies opened fire upon the Salamanders and the Raven Guard. Hundreds died in the fury of the first moments, hundreds more in the seconds following, as volley after volley of bolter fire and missiles scythed through their unsuspecting ranks. Explosions flashed to life in their midst, vaporizing warriors and tearing through tanks as force of 4 legions ripped the beating heart from the first wave of loyalists. Ferrus Manus watched in mute horror as he saw a storm of fire engulf Corax, and a titanic explosion mushroomed skyward from where Vulcan stood. in astonished outrage at what was happening. Even as terrifying carnage was being wreaked upon the loyalists below, the retreating forces of the War Master turned and brought their weapons to bear on the enemy warriors within their midst. Hundreds of World Eaters, sons of Horus and Death Guard, fell upon the veteran companies of the Iron Hands, and though the warriors of the 10th Legion continued to fight gallantly, they were hopelessly outnumbered and would soon be hacked to pieces. Ferrus Manus turned to face Fulgrim, and the Primarch of the Emperor's Children could see the despair etched into his brother's features, his silver eyes dull and lifeless. To have so great a victory snatched away in an instant must be the most sublime sensation. Fulgrim almost wished to switch places with his brother, just to taste that feeling for himself. Only dismal defeat and death await you, Ferrus, said Fulgrim. Horus has commanded your death. But for the sake of our past friendship, I shall plead your case to him if you throw down your arms. You have to surrender, Ferrus. There is no escape. Ferrus Manus tore his eyes from the slaughter of the loyalist forces, his teeth bared with the volcanic fury of his homeworld. Maybe not, traitor. But only dishonor holds any terror for me, spat Ferrus. The Emperor's loyal warriors will not surrender to you. Not now. Not ever. You will have to kill every last one of us. So be it, said Fulgrim, launching himself towards Ferrus Manus, swinging his mighty warhammer. The Primarch's weapons, forged in brotherhood but wielded in vengeance, met in a blazing plume of energy, and the battlefield was illuminated for hundreds of meters by their ferocious energies. The two Primarchs traded blows with their monstrously powerful weapons, the strength to defeat armies and topple mountains unleashed as they fought like gods, forced to end their dispute in the realm of mortals. Ferrus Manus was wielding his flaming blade in fiery slashes, his every blow defeated by the ebony-hafted hammer he had borne in countless campaigns. Fulgrim swung his hammer in great looping arcs, its heavy head powerful enough to crush the armor of a titan to paste. Both warriors fought with the hatred only brothers divided can muster, their armor dented, torn, and blackened by the fury of their conflict. To fight an opponent of such magnificence was a privilege, and Fulgrim savored every clash of hammer and sword, every fiery line cut across his flesh, and every grunt of pain torn from his brother's mouth as Forgebreaker glanced his armor. The circle in the midst of cries of pain and roaring savage glee, the Morlocks of Ferrus Manus slain before a last few desperate heroes. Ferrus cut the shoulder guard from Fulgrim's armor and spun it inside his guard to deliver a lethal thrust towards his groin. Fulgrim stepped to meet the blow, batting aside the tip of the fiery sword with the haft of Forgebreaker and hammering the warhammer's head towards Ferrus's skull. The Primarch of the Iron Hands took the blow, dropping to one knee and lashing out with his blade as blood streamed from the terrible wound in his temple. The sword's fiery tip cut across Fulgrim's stomach, opening his armor and tearing through his flesh. The pain was indescribable, and Fulgrim fell back, dropping his hammer as his hand sought to stem the blood pouring from his body. Both Primarchs faced each other on their knees through a haze of pain and blood, and Fulgrim once again felt the ache of sadness well within him. the pain of his wounds, and the sight of his brother's broken skull coated in blood tore a window into his mind. The sensation was like a powerful gust of fresh mountain air, clearing away the fog that had wrapped him in a suffocating embrace for so long that he no longer noticed it until it was gone. "My brother," he whispered. "My friend." "You have long since lost the right to call me friend," snarled Ferris, pushing himself to his feet and staggering towards Fulgrim with Fireblade raised to smite him. Fulgrim cried out, and his hand leapt unbidden to his waist as the flaming blade carved a burning path toward his neck. Silver steel flashed as he drew the sword he had taken from the Lair Temple and blocked the descending weapon. Ferris's sword hissed and spat as it bit into the silver blade, the Primarch of the Iron Hand's strength forcing the blazing metal, ceramite by centimeter toward Fulgrim's face. "No!" cried Fulgrim. "This is not right." The amethyst stone at the hilt of Fulgrim's sword pulsed with an evil light, bathing Ferrus Manus' face in a leering purple glare. Energy streamed from the blade. A musky smoke billowed around them, deadening sounds and obscuring sight. Fulgrim felt a monstrous presence swell around him, its power and nameless essence more intoxicating and dreadful than anything he could have ever imagined. Diabolical strength flooded his limbs as he pushed against the power of Ferrus Manus, feeling his brother's surprise at the resistance. With a cry of animal rage, he surged to his feet and hurled Ferrus Manus back, spinning and lashing out with his sword. The silver edge bit deep into the breastplate of his brother's armor, and the Primarch of the Iron Hands cried out, falling to his knees once again as the blade's flaring energies parted his dark armor like a fingernail through the cold grease. Hot blood sprayed from the wound, and Fireblade slid from Ferris's hands as he grasped in fierce agony. "Finish him! Kill him!" the voice screamed. And to Fulgrim, it seemed as though it echoed across time and space as well within his skull. He staggered with the blunt force of its imperative, lurching as though his limbs were not his to control. His normal grace and elan were forsaken as he falteringly raised the silver sword in preparation of delivering the death blow to Ferrus Manus. Unknown energies coruscated along the notched blade and down the length of his arm into the meat of the bone of his wounded body. Fulgrim was wreathed in purple fire. Crackling arcs of lightning caressed him with a lover's tenderness, seeking out his open wounds and licking them with balefire as they sought entry into his flesh. Fulgrim stood above Ferrus Manus, his chest heaving convulsively as his entire body shook with the violence of the power that sought to claim him. "You must die, otherwise he will kill you." Fulgrim looked down at his defeated opponent and saw his own reflection in the mirrors of Ferris's eyes. In an instant that stretched for eternity, he saw what he had become and what monstrous betrayal he had allowed himself to be party to. He knew in that eternal moment that he had made a terrible mistake in drawing the sword from the Lair Temple, and he fought to release the damnable blade he had brought with him so low. His grip was locked onto the weapon, and even as he recognized how far he had fallen, he knew that he had come too far to stop. The realization, coupled with the knowledge that everything he had striven for had been a lie. As though moving in slow motion, Fulgrim saw Ferrus Manus reaching for his fallen sword, his fingers closing around the wire-wound grip and the flames leaping once more to the blade's creator's touch. Kill him before he kills you. Now! Fulgrim's blade seemed to move with a life of its own, but it had no need of such impellence, for he swung the blade of his own volition. The silver blade clove the air as it swept towards Ferrus Manus, and Fulgrim felt the ancient triumph of the presence that he now knew had dwelt within it all the time. He tried desperately to pull the blow, but his muscles were no longer his own to control. Unnatural warp-forged steel met the iron flesh of a Primarch, its aberrant edge cutting through Ferrus's skin, muscle, and bone with a shrieking howl that echoed in realms beyond those knowable to mortals. Blood and the monumental energies bound within the meat and gristle of one of the Emperor's sons erupted from the wound, and Fulgrim fell back as the searing powers blinded him. Dropping the silver sword at his side, he heard a shrieking wail as of a choir of banshees whip around him as a phantom skeletal hands clawed at him and 1,000 voices tore at his mind. Ghostly whirlwinds seized him and spun him around, twisting him like a limp rag in their grip and threatening to tear him limb for limb in retribution. Even as he welcomed such oblivion, he felt another presence move to protect him. The same presence that had guided his sword arm, the same presence that had been his constant companion since Laren, though he had not known it. Fulgrim fell to the ground as the winds released him, and faded with a shrieking howl of anguish. Frustration. He landed heavily and rolled onto his side, heaving great gulps of cold air into his lungs as the sound of the battle returned to him. He heard cries of pain, gunfire, explosions, and the rhythmic crack of bolters as they fired relentless volley after volley. It was the sound of death. It was the sound of a massacre. His entire body aching with pain and loss, Fulgrim pushed himself upright. Blood and the detritus of battle surrounded him, the stoic figures of armored warriors staring in wonder at the headless body that lay on the black ground before him. Fulgrim took a shuddering breath and raised his hands to the heavens, screaming his loss at the sight of his brother so cruelly murdered. "What have I done?" he howled. "Throne, save me. What have I done?" What needed to be done? Fulgrim heard the voice, a sibilant whisper in his ear, the breath of the speaker hot on his neck. He twisted his neck, but there was nothing to be seen, no unseen speaker or mysterious presence. "He's dead," whispered Fulgrim, the aching loss and guilt of his crime too monstrous to believe. "I killed him." "You did. You did. With your own hands you struck down your brother. He who had only thought well of you and fought faithfully with you through all the long years." He was my brother." "He was. And all he ever did was honor you." Now that's a Halloween story. I don't know what's more horrible than losing control of your body to a demon and then slaying someone you love. But again, Fulgrim had a moment where he realized what he was doing. If you've read all of the Fulgrim and the rest of his story, when he is on a campaign on a planet called Laren, that is where he is initially infected with chaos, and chaos finds that moment, that crack in his armor to exploit. And that is Fulgrim's desire for perfection. And in a temple on that planet, Fulgrim has a sword, the Anathame, the Anathame. And then also remember, Horus is wounded with a Xenos blade as well that's imbued with chaos power. Basically the same thing has happened to Fulgrim, but instead of him being stabbed with the sword, he has just had it on his hilt for a while. And Fulgrim says it himself, when I took the thing, I knew it was evil, but I took it anyway. And that evil has been seeping into him. But that was a gradual moment he didn't stay awake for. And it cost him the dearest relationship that he had. And it was by his own hands, whether he lost control or not. What a metaphor. I mean, think of the world we live in where now everybody has an excuse for why they act the way they act. And it wasn't me. Yeah, it was you. I'm sorry. Look at me. It was you. Like, now, granted, there are a few extenuating circumstances for 90% of us. It was us. Like, that's why I hate that whole, the devil made me do it. Did he though? Feel like you just suck. And let's quit blaming the devil for stuff he didn't do. Because sometimes it's just us being bad. And that's what happened here. That evil got into Fulgrim because he let it in. He knew not to go there. He knew not to take that blade. He knew it was evil. And he took it. And it infested him and infested his entire legion. Fulgrim's legion isn't just corrupt. They are grotesque. When you read about the stuff that Fabius Bile was doing in his dungeon, which is why I didn't read that, because I'm not sure the guidelines will let me let me go there, because some of them is like, oh no. So yeah. But this good story for Halloween, it's horrifying. It's horrifying. But it's a lesson. Stay awake in the gradual moments. Then you won't get a suddenly that you didn't plan for. So that one was actually kind of fun to read. Let me know if you enjoyed that one. I'm going to be doing this Warhammer Wednesday on Tuesday because that's when Halloween is, and I'll get back on regular schedule the following week. So hope you enjoy this one. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and share it around. Really appreciate the folks who give me encouragement in the comments because I really enjoy doing this, and I'll keep doing it as long as people want to see it. See you in the next one. Haba.